Welcome to the Bookshop at the End of the Internet. This podcast is dedicated to helping book lovers discover new authors. Like all the best bookshops, this podcast is filled with all kinds of books and all kinds of authors. So tune in, browse around, find a new author, and discover a new favorite book at the Bookshop at the End of the Internet. I'm Stacey Horan, author, book lover, and host of the Bookshop at the End of the Internet. This is episode number 245. For more information about this or any of our episodes, go to my website, staceyhoran.com. If you enjoy the podcast, leave us a review, like us on social media, and share us with your friends, family, and fellow readers. In today's episode of the Bookshop at the End of the Internet, I'm chatting with author Josh Mendoza about his debut novel, Shadow of the Eternal Watcher, a classic noir detective story that spirals into a sci-fi adventure/space opera. The main character, Duster Raines, is an ambulance-chasing private investigator who is well on his way to hitting rock bottom when he finds himself dragged into a mystery that crosses multiple realities. And he glimpses a version of himself that is so much more than he is in this world. Josh drew upon his background as a screenwriter and filmmaker when writing this novel, and his intention was to take traditional tropes of the genres and bend them in the style of the Twilight Zone. In this episode, I'll chat with Josh about his writing journey, how he always wanted to be a novelist long before being distracted by filmmaking, and why one of the most important parts of the process for him is receiving honest feedback during editing, as well as a few other things coming up. Josh Mendoza, thank you very much for joining me today on the podcast.
Well, thanks for having me, Stacey. I'm excited to be here.
I thought what we could do today is start by talking about your debut novel, Shadow of the Eternal Watcher. If you don't mind, tell us a little bit about this book and what inspired you to write it.
Yeah, so Shadow of the Eternal Watcher is a classic noir detective story set in Los Angeles that spirals into a big space opera science fiction adventure. So, I'm also a screenwriter. I'm a filmmaker. I was actually in post on my first feature film, What Still Remains. And I had this idea for these two ideas. I had the space opera idea and I had the detective story idea. And I like to do genre mashups. So I thought, wouldn't it be fun to try to make them work as both? So some of the fun of this book was the mystery being that he's in a science fiction story, right? The detective's solving this murder mystery / missing persons case and kind of starts to discover he's in a world he didn't realize he was in. And I started originally writing it as a screenplay, and thinking about it, I just knew it was going to be a very expensive movie and I wasn't probably ever going to get that made. And I pivoted back to what I originally wanted to do. I always wanted to be a novelist. That's what I originally went to school for before I got pulled into movies and got distracted. And so getting back to that original idea and studying and was just exciting and fun, and it got to flex some different muscles too, because being a screenwriter is a little different than a novelist. You get a little more room with a novel, but that can also be a trap, right? Because you can babble on and not necessarily go where you want to go. So it was a challenge, but also just exciting, and it's fun to have it out now.
Yeah, I wanted to ask how much you thought being a filmmaker and a screenwriter colored or informed or influenced how you wrote the novel, how you approached it, how you thought about character, how you thought about plot, how you thought about the scenes.
Yeah.
How much of that did you draw on? Did you rely on? Did you utilize? And how much did you just have to sort of ignore and try a completely different approach? I'm curious, that push and pull.
Yeah, obviously it's a little both. You got to ignore some of it, but I'm a very visual guy, so that's why I got into movies in the first place. When I was used to write short stories, I sort of was writing camera moves when I first started writing. So it definitely lent itself well in that medium. So coming back to writing a novel, I mean, definitely thinking about blocking, thinking about like if I were actually going to film this, I think grounds your writing in a reality, right? If you imagine an actual room and where stuff is, it sounds simple, but not every writer does that, right? And I think that just gives you anchors to tie your story to and help guide your reader through. And in terms of scenes, I mean, I always think about what's my in, what's my out, what are my characters doing, and how is this driving the plot and the story forward? And if I can't answer all those questions, why do my characters care? Why are they here? It probably doesn't need to be in the book, in the script. So I mean that those things are true in either. Screenplays are so character driven and plot driven. So I just focus on character and try to create cool, fun characters that people would want to go on other adventures with on future novels too.
Yeah. What about the difference between the internal world of your characters? Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
in a screenplay and film, you rely heavily on actors to bring all of that
Yeah.
to life, right? They can't speak what's going on in their head, so you rely on them physically to be able to convey what's happening. What was the
Yeah.
difference between just, writing a screenplay and assuming, okay, the actors will bring this out, you'll be able to see this
Yeah.
turmoil, versus in the novel, like having to dump that all
Mm-hmm.
into the chapter?
Yeah, so I mean, with the screenplay, you still have description, and but if you have blocks of description, right, no one's going to read this script. So it's you think about what are my visuals that can cue this up. But I think that's a good skill for a novel too. I mean, with screenplays, you're always saying show don't tell, right? So I think sometimes some novels can get a little too telly in a way too. So I think sometimes I was able to pull myself back in the over description. I get it out there. I always think it's easier, obviously, to edit what's on the page versus just staring at a blank screen. So I definitely probably had some versions of this that were over descriptive, over intellectualized. It's a first person novel, so you definitely get a lot of Dustin Rains's thoughts in this book. So it's just getting it out there and then pulling it back. And sometimes you'll write stuff and it's not working, and you may delete 2 or 3 pages and put things together that didn't originally go together. And it's amazing how sometimes all that stuff that happened in between, it doesn't need to be in there, but it informs what's happening for your characters. And then it works better without it, but it's there. It's subtext. It happened for you, the writer. And I think you can, the readers can feel that.
Yeah. Well, let's help our listeners out a bit, because you mentioned that this is sort of a mashup,
Yeah.
different genres, and people don't automatically assume detective noir pairs well with sci-fi space opera. So, can you, without giving away too many spoilers, can you give the listeners a little bit of an idea of what this plot line looks like, how these two things are woven
Yeah.
together? And then I want to talk about the main character, but let's talk about
Definitely.
that plot before.
Well, the plot, I mean, we meet Dustin Raines down on his luck, just kind of the classic, almost stereotypical noir detective. He's a drunk loser who thinks he's hit rock bottom, and we come to find out that he can definitely fall further. And that's kind of the fun of the book, too. But, I think as a writer, I mean, I'm a huge cinephile, and I've always been a huge book lover. I'm both. So knowing all these stories, knowing all the tropes, and then getting to put them in. And sometimes people be like, "Oh, I've seen that before." But then, what's your different take on it? How do you break it? And how do you bend it? So in the sci-fi world, I mean, we've gotten pretty used to these multiverses now. They're kind of become ubiquitous. But for me, I was going back further. I was thinking more Twilight Zone. I was thinking what that kind of like step through this door and into another dimension and something crazy happens, right? So like more the surprise of it. So for me, it was like, all right, I'm going to do a multiverse thing, but in my multiverse, there's only seem to be two humanities that still survive, and there aren't a double of everyone. So where there are doubles, that's where magic can happen, and it definitely gets more into a magical realism, uh, fantasy sci-fi vibe than more of a technical sci-fi vibe, which is just more my inclinations and where I like to go too. So as Dustin Raines solves this mystery, these from the very get-go, you get clues as you go that there's science fiction, there's something else going on, and as we get into it, it becomes this multiversal story where he is actually one of these people that has a duplicate, and his duplicate, as is classic in a story, it happens to be more important than he is. But I think as a writer, for me, it was interesting to look at the character of Duster, who's at rock bottom, always thought he would be something else. I mean, he was a war hero. He was a decorated detective before he lost his job with the LAPD, and now he's this essentially an ambulance chaser PI, right? But he's looking at his life saying, I was going to be more than this, and then literally sees the version of himself that is better than that. And I think Duster Raines is not necessarily a good guy. He's not a bad guy. He skates this line, and I think that's interesting for me too. Is he good? Is he bad? And is his double bad or is he good? And I think that's been around forever. German cinema, the doppelganger. I think human beings are interested in this dark side of themselves, demonic side, like this other. So they were just fun tropes to play with. But again, how do I do them differently and how do I bend them was where I wanted to take this story to.
So how did you approach the world building for this? Because you've
Mm-hmm.
got sort of this gritty LA, which people are familiar with, if, it's at least from
Mm-hmm.
cinema and stuff, they can imagine that. So how did you marry that with this sci-fi multiverse element? Did you do planning before you started writing, or did that kind of develop as you just started writing the story?
Yeah, I do plan a little bit. I'm not a huge outliner, but I definitely had some thoughts on what I wanted that world to look like. I'm a big history buff, so definitely there's elements of Chinese Empire, Roman Empire, and essentially this universe shattered from our own 2000, 2500 years ago, and it's so different you can't even recognize it. But then going back, looking at these different cultures and like what were they like, and trying to imagine a different kind of dystopian future where these things meshed and just went on a different trajectory than ours did, and basically had more of a golden age in the when we were having the dark ages and the middle ages, and where would that society that was plowing ahead with technology be compared to our own, and how does that impact still those human elements too? Because I mean, human beings, I think when you read history, you look at people 2000 years ago and you can see that they're really just like us without cell phones and without the weaponry we have and without the technology we have. And it's interesting to kind of try to project yourself into a different future that doesn't exist too.
Yeah, yeah. So when you read, when you consume movies and TV, are these the kind of stories, Shadow of the Eternal Watcher? Is this the kind of story you would reach for, or is this new for you?
Mm-hmm. No, I definitely always try to write something I would want to see on the shelf. I mean, when I was a kid, I was the kid in the indie bookstore sitting in the sci-fi section. I mean, I devoured Dune and all those, but I was also just reading every Star Wars expanded universe book I could get my hands on. So I read the whole gamut. I read the literary, but I mean, I love it all too. I mean, I like comedy, I like fiction. So I mean, I'm definitely a student of just storytelling in general. But this is definitely a book that I would want to see. And that's true of my movie too. And I always just try to write stories of things that I think would be fun that I haven't seen before too.
Right, right. You mentioned earlier that you were hoping like people would like these characters and maybe
Mm-hmm.
would want to see more of them. Is your plan to make this more of a series or?
Yeah, I mean, this book stands on its own. It definitely, I think when you read it, you'll see that there's room for more. And I definitely sort of imagined maybe a trilogy, maybe four. I definitely am working on a second now. I waited until it came out because honestly, I mean, I wasn't sure where the publishing notes would go, where these different things would go. I didn't want to start writing the next one, and then it's like, oh well, maybe we should go in a completely different direction or kill this character, and then it's like, oh, well, I have 90,000 words, and that character's the second main person. But
Right, right.
so I think I have some ideas for Duster Raines. I mean, it definitely has become more. It gets more into that sci-fi element. So where does that go? But he's still a detective. So what's the mystery he's trying to solve, and where is his character going? And I mean, like I said, he sort of skirts these lines. He's almost an anti-hero. So some of the characters I put around him are almost me, trying to pull him back from the darkness too. And I think it would be interesting to see how reliant he is on them and where they're going to go to. And does he end up saving them like he wants, or is he just more of a destructive force that
Right. Right.
can't help himself?
When you're writing or when you're thinking about the story, do you have like a metrics that you use or balance that you try and achieve between sort of this, the big landscape and the big story, the bigger world, and the
Mhm.
smaller micro story, the internal world of the character? Do you just write, get to the end of the chapter, and say that feels like a good balance, or is it a constant checking in? How do you balance? Because yours is a big sweeping world,
Yeah.
right? So how do
I
you
mean,
balance the big with the small?
again, I think it has to serve characters. So, I mean, I'm more about the micro and the small and following these people. And then the world is interesting and fun and and I don't want to say window dressing because it's more than that, it's almost its own character, but I'm not the kind of writer who's going to spend 50 pages talking about the cityscape and then be like, oh, and oh, by the way, here's the characters, they're doing something, which, some people love those kinds of novels, and I can think of a few I've read that I like, but that's not me. I'm more interested in seeing these worlds through the character's eyes, and how does that inform the narrative and the plot too, and what's happening. And I don't really like to cool my jets in stories, so I'm trying to always be moving forward and trying to drive it forward. So this story definitely is always on the move, and then the world around them is happening as they go.
Yeah. How do you keep up the pace of the story? Because, like you said, there's this detective mystery, which is, they're designed to be sort of these thoughtful puzzles,
Mm,
right? And yet you've got the sci-fi element, which sort of lends itself to more of an action sort of feel or an
yeah.
adventure. Or so, how do you keep the plot going? How do you keep the reader turning the page?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a lot of action. I mean, it definitely is an action story. But I think the more puzzly parts, I try to build suspense. It has a thriller vibe to it, where anytime he's in a situation, there's a ticking time bomb of something's coming, something's happening. I need to be. I'm on the. He's literally on the lam in this book, so he needs to like stay ahead of people, and I think that helps keep it moving. And when he does stand still, things tend to catch up with him. And he has a lot of internal demons too. That when things are not after him on the outside, his brain does plenty to him on the inside. So I think the character also lent itself to being able to drive forward. And there's a little bit of is what can you trust him? Is what's happening at all times happening, and can you believe his perspective of it? And I think that's interesting too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is Duster Raines a character? I want to say, did you two questions really? Did you enjoy writing him, and is he someone you would like? Because you spend a
Mm-hmm.
lot of time with him, right? He has been in your head for a long time. So, did you enjoy writing him as a character? And then, is this someone you would want to spend time with?
Yeah. I think it's interesting because I kind of almost, I'm not a great actor, but I work with actors. So I kind of almost think of it like that, where you're getting into their headspace. It's not what I would do. It's not who I am. It's who he is, and trying to think about what he would do. But at the same time, there was a give and take, because I definitely think there were times where he went too far into that darkness I spoke of. And maybe when people read it, it was like, no, you lost me. I don't really like this guy anymore. Because I wanted him to be likable. I mean, that was the thing. Like, you can't just read a book and be like, man, that guy was terrible. It's like, why would you read it? So, I mean, he's charming and funny. And his ex-girlfriend, who's also his lawyer, is a predominant character in this book. And she's brilliant and interesting. And I think it's interesting too, because why is she with him? Right. And I think it obviously didn't work out. And I think a lot of us have those relationships where they didn't work out, but they could have been better. And you always like the what ifs of that. And that kind of ties into the theme of the book too. But I think it has to be believable that she would find him interesting too. Right. So, like, if he's just awful and she's great, and it's like, oh yeah, we used to be together, and that doesn't make any sense, then the world's not lived in, and it's not real. And I think people can make mistakes in who they're with too. And again, that's an interesting character point too. So, I mean, he was fun to write. I think he's funny and, just trying to make him, again, he's back and forth, he skirts, and he's kind of a wild card too. So sometimes he does things out of the blue that kind of blow things up too. And I think that's just interesting and fun.
Yeah, yeah. Are there messages in the book that you want the readers to to see, or questions you want them to think about, takeaways
Yeah.
for the reader? And if there are, like, what would those be? And did you have those in mind when you started writing, or is it a case of you wrote it and you're like, oh, okay, that's what it's about?
Yeah, all writing is rewriting. So a good writer goes back, or a great writer goes back and makes it seem like they had the plan the whole time, right? But you definitely have these ideas. And to me, it was originally about, I've sort of already spoken to it, but this fallen person, and can he be redeemed? And does he want, he doesn't necessarily want redemption. He wants peace, right? And he's always trying to atone for these sins. So I think it's a character study in what do we want and where do we want the world to be like for ourselves, and does that even matter? And like, could he have been happy if he'd just taken what he had and lived with it? Because he had some good stuff, and he again he blows things up, he throws grenades into things. So he's a little self-destructive in that sense. And I think on a macro level with the sci-fi, I mean, what makes us tick as human beings, and what do we do to each other? And when you've apparently reached this pinnacle society, are we still fighting over resources? Are we still fighting over who gets to be included in the club? What rungs of society are people on, and how do we treat them? And I think that's a playground that a lot of sci-fi is played in, and I think it's interesting to get to explore. And that's what's cool about sci-fi, because you can step outside of our own world but still look at human conditions and not turn people off to analyzing that too. Because I think sometimes when you analyze it in our own world, people have their own predispositions. They've already made up their minds on those things. But when you're like, well, this is a completely different world, and look, there's aliens, and there's this and there's that, and how do
Right.
we treat them? And I think it makes people think, and that's exciting as a writer, to get to try to not trick people, but spin it a different way and be like, maybe you didn't think about this in that way, and can you explore that through the story?
Right, right. Yeah, I think sci-fi, fantasy, those types of genres give people permission
Mm-hmm.
to think about those bigger questions
Yes, I agree.
without all the other things that they bring with them, all the other biases and prejudices that we have, that we sometimes we're aware of them, sometimes we're not. But when you're looking at something that looks completely foreign to you, right? It's
Mm,
magical, or it's outer space, or it's whatever. It's easier to have those questions, have
yeah,
those just conversations. I think it gives people permission to even question what they assumed, or
yeah. Well, and
um,
sometimes you can be like, oh, I think this, and you're reading the story, and then you kind of, if you actually turn it back to the real world, you're like, well, why do I think the opposite over here? And I think that's why I'm a big believer in reading and just getting in other people's headspace, and it helps you see the world through other people's eyes, and hopefully be a better person through doing that too.
yeah. Do you think there is something about characters like Duster Raines, people who are down in their luck, people who most people would say, "Oh, he's worse off than I am,"
Mm-hmm.
right? I mean, it's because, and you've made him a hard luck case. I mean,
Yeah.
you've designed him that way, so he will be worse off than most people, hopefully. Do you think there's a draw to reading about someone like that and seeing them figure things out or make things a little better for themselves? Do you think we're
Yeah.
just naturally drawn to that?
I think I was thinking about that when you were talking too. I mean, I think we tend to be drawn. It's interesting how sometimes you'll see people and they like love the villain, right? And you're like, oh, people love Darth Vader. It's like, well, why do you like the guy who's obviously the bad, right? And I think with Duster, I mean, when you put someone in such a terrible spot and then put them in extreme circumstances, they make extreme situational decisions, right? And I think it speaks to a primal survival instinct within all of us of what would you do in the same situation. And also, I mean, but for the grace of fate and God, there go I, right? And it's like, well, why does that person have this and I don't? And I think that's just human nature too, to question those things and think about those things. And I mean, and we can see that in our own world where you look around and you're like, well, at least I'm not over there living that, but like very easily could have just been born there. I mean, that's just dumb luck, right? And a microcosm of how the universe works, where it's random.
Yeah.
And I think that that's a big theme in this book too, is like, does the universe care about me? And like, why are all these things happening? And obviously there's some sort of like bigger thing happening and I can see these other outcomes, but is it just an indifferent, uncaring, cold machine, or is there like a plan? And I think that's a thing we all think about it, whether it be on a spiritual level or just on a day to day, like why can't I pay this bill, right? And I think that's just human nature.
Yeah. Yeah. You mentioned you were working on the second book,
Mm-hmm.
the follow-on to Shadow of the Eternal Watcher. How do you write? Because I'm curious about process. If we can change tack for a bit.
Yeah,
You mentioned you're not a huge plotter, but you at least have
no,
some ideas, some parameters for yourself. But are you someone who is very regimented about your writing, either how you write or the tools you use or the time you do it, or is it a case of
no.
just
I
whenever
try to write every day, but it is kind of whatever because life gets in the way. I have a
it
couple
does?
kids too, so it's I've got like four full-time jobs over here. But for me, I think about it as a marathon, and I think about it as achievable goals, right? So like a novel, like an average novel is like 80,000 words. So if I can write 500 to 1,000 words every time I sit down, I will have a draft of a book in like 6 months or less, right?
Yeah,
So, and try to do more. Stephen King, I think, says he writes 2,000 words a day, and I think that's admirable. And I don't always get there. And sometimes it's okay to sit there and not write very much, but you're
right.
thinking. And I try to let myself be bored. I try to let myself not be on the internet, not be on my phone, which is hard to do, right? But like when you let yourself get lost in the boredom and the story and you're thinking about it, that's when things can happen. And I mean, I was doing it the other day and all of a sudden I was like, oh, wow, I wrote like 2,500 words. And like, you go back and read it and some of it's not good, but like, you're like, where did that come from? And I think that's where that muse kind of starts to speak to you is when you just let yourself go. And I always talk about my characters letting them surprise me. And that's why I don't like to overplot. I mean, I have like directions I want them to go. I mean, you can't just like sit down and be like, I'm writing a book and what's
Hmm.
it about? I don't know. And just start writing. I mean, you have to have
Right,
some
right,
sort of plan, but
right.
um, as you put people in situations and maybe you haven't overdone what they're going to necessarily do, sometimes surprises can happen. And sometimes, you do some things and you write yourself into a corner and then you got to get yourself out of it too. But
Yeah,
I think it's all a balance of planning versus spontaneity for me.
yeah,
And but just showing up and doing the work too. I mean, that's the thing is it is a job. It is a process. And I think that's the thing that some people like get lost in, like, oh, how would I even ever do that? And you just really have to treat it like anything. If you're going to get in shape, you got to like have a plan. I'm going to the gym. I'm going 3 times a week. So same with the book, right? If you're going to write 3 times a week, cool. When is it going to be? And if it's 1,000 words every time you sit down, get that goal. And then how long is it going to take you to finish? And just, if you miss a day, you got to make it up, right? And
right.
treat it like that versus I'll get to it when I get to it. And I think that's why a lot of people are like, because I think everyone thinks, oh, I have a book. I think most people think they have a book in them, but it's the more than one book is hard, but also just doing the first one is
Right,
hard. Just
right.
showing up and doing it.
Yeah.
And then there's obviously craft to it too. And I think I've studied a lot. I've gone to taken a lot of writing classes, but also just written a lot of stuff too. That write screenplays, a lot of short stories that aren't necessarily going to win any awards. Some of them have. So you write like the bad ones and you build on that and you like get people's feedback and you progress as a person and as a writer too. And I think that's so
Yeah.
important to me is just having a community of people, of creatives who you can go to and trust to read your stuff and give you honest feedback. And I'll just tell you, oh yeah, it's great. You're awesome. And then you take that feedback and you as the writer have to say, okay, well, in chapter 10, they didn't like XYZ and they told me to do these things, and those are not what I'm going to do. But they have a problem with this character and they don't like it because of this. So you have to like hear the problem and then figure out, you as the writer, how are you going to fix that, right? And because when you write, everyone's got an opinion. So you give it to someone and let them read it. They're going to tell you what they think, and they're going to tell you a lot of ideas of like, it could be this, it could be that, it could be anything.
Right. Right.
And of course it could be anything, but it's what you want it to be. So you have to decipher what they're trying to tell you too.
Yeah.
Because sometimes people will be like thinking they're helping you and giving feedback of do this and do that. And you have to, as the writer, hear, okay, this is the problem though. So how am I
Right.
going to fix the problem?
Right. Right.
Yeah.
And it may be a simple case of what you're trying to convey isn't coming through,
Mm.
which is why they're
Yeah. And
providing you with the
sometimes that's
comments.
like,
Yeah. So maybe you just haven't been clear in what your
yeah.
vision was.
Well, and like I
And that
spoke
might
to
help.
earlier, sometimes you're deleting stuff. You're like, oh, I don't need that, and this works. And sometimes you need it, so you don't put
Right.
it back.
Right.
So you should always save your old drafts too.
I
Have
know.
some backups so you can just go back and copy and paste and not recreate.
Right. Well, what do you find to be the hardest part for you for writing novels? And is it the same thing that you find difficult with any other type of writing, screenwriting or short stories or anything like that?
Yeah. Well, you have to do it because you love it, honestly. I mean,
Mm.
like, because there's a lot of no's, there's a lot of criticism, and with screenplays too, you write these things and they get you in these rooms and you pitch the big executives or whoever, and then they're like, okay, well, call me when you're famous, or they don't say that, but that's the subtext. That's the writer in me. But it's like, in sometimes you'll sell something and it'll just sit on a shelf. So the cool thing about a book is, I mean, it's its own beast of getting it out too. The naive me is like, well, I'll write a book because a movie costs $10 million and I won't have to raise $10 million if I write the book. It'll just be done. But there's a whole process to getting these things out, and books are still kind of an archaic, slow process of getting them out too, and it takes a while. So there has to be some patience, and you have to just keep slugging ahead. So that's my thing too, because inevitably too, I mean, now this book's out, or when my movie came out, I mean, people are always like, well, what else you got? What's next? And you're like, well, I just had the book come out. It's like been
Right.
out for like 10 seconds, but they want to know what else you got. So you got to have
Right.
other stuff too. And if you don't have other stuff, don't be discouraged. Just say, okay, well, I better write more stuff. Because I think too, sometimes it's easy to be like, this is my great idea. Like I had a script when I first started writing that I loved, and I still have that script, and I pitched that around, and it almost got made, but it's changed so many darn times in the last 20 years. And if I'd only ever focused on that script, I mean, you wouldn't be talking to me right now, right? But
Right.
it's okay to walk away from them, come back to them and sometimes you'll come back to things and be like, man, I used to love this, but this isn't me anymore. So I'm going to either it goes in the dustbin or you're going to rewrite it, right?
Right. Right. Well, it sounds like you're busy with
I'm
your four
trying to
jobs
be.
and your sequel. But if people want to keep up with you, learn more about you and the books, and look for the new release when it's available and the goings on, that sort of thing,
Yeah.
where can they go to find you and that information?
Well, my website's probably the easiest, which is just my name, joshmendoza.com. You can catch some updates there, and there's links to my movie and to the book there. And, you can read the book wherever books are sold. So you can find that on Amazon, Barnes and Noble. You can go into your favorite indie bookstore and they can order it. So it's available. You just got to go ask for it. Shadow the Eternal Watcher. And in terms of keeping up with me, other than the website, I'm on Twitter, Instagram. It's not Twitter anymore. X, whatever we call it. Blue Sky. I'm on all those things, and I'm at Mendoza Strikes is where you can find me.
Good. Well, Josh, I want to thank you very much for joining me today on the podcast. And I want to wish you luck with Shadow of the Eternal Watcher and your work in progress. Good luck with that. We'll look forward to that in the near future or distant future, whenever it's ready. So, congratulations on everything you've accomplished so far. Best of luck with the rest of your writing journey.
Thank you, Stacey. I appreciate you having me on. It was fun.
The Bookshop at the End of the Internet is a podcast dedicated to helping book lovers discover new authors. Like any good bookshop, this podcast features a wide variety of books by the equally varied and interesting authors who felt compelled to write them. This podcast gives you a chance to meet these wonderful writers and discover your next must-read book. Listen to the authors describe their books and tell you their stories in their own words. My interviews feature books from all genres and authors from all walks of life, including those who are indie published as well as those published by small presses and large publishing houses. Looking for unique, not so easy to find books for yourself, a friend, or a book club? Tune into this podcast and find your newest favorite author or maybe a soon-to-be bestseller. This podcast, like all the best bookshops, is filled with all kinds of books and all kinds of authors. Tune in, browse around, find a new author, and discover a new favorite book. You never know what treasures you might find in the Bookshop at the End of the Internet.